All right, I hope everybody is having a great day today. So right now I'm at 4 Mile Ecological Park in Cape Coral, Florida. And so we're gonna take a look at mangroves today. And so, real interesting thing is that we're not actually looking at any mangroves right now. I'm in the parking lot. So this is Veterans Parkway. If you've ever been to Cape Coral, you cross the Veterans Bridge, you've driven by this park. It's where all the flags and war memorials and the Iwo Jima statue is. And but immediately over here, right along the edge, we have a lot of our upland species. We've got some oaks, we've got some pines, our palmettos. Right here, this is the Florida coffee. But if you can see in the video, and we're gonna walk down there in a minute, we've got some sea grapes right there and some mangroves very quickly appearing down this hill. And if you notice, there's a pretty stark elevation change right there. So as soon as we hit this change in elevation, we're gonna see our mangroves start to appear. So again, if you visit any of these parks, make sure you're following the rules, not littering, recycling, things like that. So as we walk down the boardwalk, first thing you'll notice, we are going downhill. And you'll notice that was a pretty stark ecotone because we saw a bunch of upland species right there along the road. And then suddenly we are surrounded by mangroves. And so the first species of mangrove that we typically are going to encounter above the high tide line are our white mangroves. And one of the easiest ways to distinguish mangroves is their propagules. And I don't see any on the ground, but if I do find some white mangrove propagules today, I will definitely show them to you. White mangroves typically grow above the high tide line. So they're in areas that aren't typically wet by tidal water. So if you look down, I don't know if you could tell, but there is a little bit of water right here. And so most of this water that we're encountering here, this is rainwater. We've had several inches of rain in the last couple of days. So primarily right up here, we're gonna see white mangroves. And as we continue on to the boardwalk towards the mid-marsh, we'll see a mixture of black mangroves, which typically grow in the tidal wetlands, and some of the red mangroves. And then once we make our way down to the coastline, we'll primarily see the red mangrove. One thing you may notice as we're walking along is there's actually a lot of these leaves all over the ground. And if you actually look up at the trees, there are a lot of yellow and brown leaves inside the mangroves. So the reason that you're seeing that is not because mangroves are deciduous. They continue to lose leaves year round. They actually drop a significant amount of leaves, but it's actually one of the ways that mangroves will deal with salt. Right? Mangroves are actually a species that will survive just fine in freshwater, but salt is actually something that they need to deal with. Right? They don't actually need the salt. And so one way that all species of mangroves deal with salt is through the process of transpiration. The salt will stay behind in the mangrove leaf. And so when the salt stays behind and that leaf has too high of a concentration of salt, the plant will actually stop supporting that leaf, and the leaf will fall off and fall down onto the ground. And so one of the really cool things about mangrove forests is that as they continuously drop these leaves year round, these leaves become the base of the mangrove food web. So they form this detritus layer. So all these animals that live down there, crabs and worms and other types of decomposers, they break these leaves down, they turn them into usable nutrients for all the vegetation we see here, and they also turn it into soil. So mangroves are continuously dropping these leaves year round, and if you have about 1 acre of mangroves, they will drop about 4 tons of leaves over the course of a year. So as we've walked in here, right, we're entering in towards this area I would call the mid-marsh, and we're starting to see some black mangroves appear. So there's some red ones mixed in here, but let's see if we could get a good angle with the camera. But if you could actually see down in there, there's some black mangroves, and they actually kind of look like little skeleton fingers or zombie fingers sticking out of the ground. So the black mangrove, right, the tree actually has what's known as a cable root, which will shoot out in different directions away from the tree. And then the cable root actually has these things called nematophores, which are these things that look kind of like zombie fingers or skeleton fingers coming out of the ground. Those are the nematophores coming off of the cable root. And what they do is they help with gas exchange and also with stabilizing the mangrove. So you can see we're in the mid-marsh here. And this area is probably where we are right now. I would say it's really only going to get water when we have a pretty high tide. Most of the water that we're seeing right in here is probably actually from the recent rainfall that we had. So while we're here, let's actually take a minute and we'll talk a little bit about red mangroves. So we'll see more red mangroves along the coastline, but red mangroves have this real distinctive arch-shaped root structure. Sometimes it's called the walking tree. It almost kind of looks like the tree is walking away. But these arch structures actually help stabilize the tree. And when they grow together in big clumps, like we've got right up here, these arches actually intertwine with each other, and the arches not only stabilize the single tree, but they intertwine together and they help stabilize each other. So all species of mangroves reproduce via propagules. And so right here, this is a red mangrove propagule. So these could actually float in the water for months. And so they will develop on the tree. This one actually fell off, but this structure develops on the tree. And this propagule has got everything it needs for this mangrove to survive for several months. This will fall into the water and it will float like this. You've probably seen these at the beach. They look kind of like a big green bean. And they will float, and then eventually it becomes a little bit waterlogged, and this end sinks down to the bottom. And then when it finds a place where it's ready to start growing, it will sink into the sand, and very quickly you'll actually see leaves start to pop out of these. So if we actually look here, this one fell on the boardwalk, but if they fall directly into soil like this, that one I just dropped, stuck right in there, and it might actually start to grow. So right here we have some propagules that have been growing, and you can see the propagules right there, and the leaves have started to pop out of them. So one more thing on the red mangroves, right? Some red mangroves, you'll actually see these roots that are kind of falling out of the tree. These are actually called drop roots. And so these ones aren't actually reaching the soil. But typically you'll see drop roots will come out of the upper branches of the red mangroves and they'll actually grow down into the soil. And so they don't actually root the tree into the soil. They actually just go into the first couple inches of the soil. And again, part of that is actually gas exchange. So a real neat thing about the mangrove ecosystem is, right, these mangroves are continuously dropping the leaf litter in the form of detritus, which we've mentioned. And as they drop the detritus, it breaks down. But very quickly, one layer of detritus builds on top of the other. And so in an anaerobic environment, it actually becomes kind of difficult for all this stuff to break down. And so it's important to have the decomposers like the crabs and things that will burrow down into it. But one thing that helps is those drop roots from the red mangroves is they will diffuse oxygen into the upper layers of the soil and help break that down. So again, still kind of in the mid-marsh here, and we've got the black mangroves. Hopefully it's showing up on the video, but we can see how the black mangroves look kind of like zombie fingers, with a couple of the red mangrove propagules have made their way in here. You can see once they start to grow, they will develop, and then they will continue to drop propagules over time. So again, we're in the mid-marsh, and this area will fill up with water. So we are just at the beginning of the rainy season, and we're going to make our way to the Caloosahatchee River. And so as the water in the Caloosahatchee River does fill up, some of that water will push back in here. When we have high tides, the high tide will actually push the water against the Caloosahatchee River, and again, that will force more water back in here. So I always encourage coming to ecosystems and field trip locations at different times of year, and you will be able to see the ecosystem look very different. So there's not a whole lot of water here right now. However, I've been here where the water is actually right up to the boardwalk. And again, when we have our extreme rainfall events or hurricanes, this boardwalk can actually be underwater. Again, here's a pretty good shot of the red mangrove propagules in various stages of growth. And then if we get right down here in the water, we can actually see those nematophores of the black mangroves popping up along the water. Alright, so as we're walking along here, we're actually getting a lot closer to the coastline. And primarily what we're seeing now is we've got the red mangroves, and you can see how their prop roots are all intertangled together to actually help stabilize the tree. And so right here what we have is a tidal creek that actually flows through the mangroves. And so with these tidal creeks, some of them, depending on where you are, some of them are created for kayak trails, and some of them are actually natural. And so when you have tide water is always going to follow the path of least resistance. And so when water comes in here, it's actually going to flow through the tidal creek a lot easier than it will flow through the mangrove wetlands. And so when this water flows through the tidal creek, it will carry sediment with it. And so that's actually what keeps this area open. And so instead of this, closing up with mangroves, the constant flow of water keeps this open. And so this tidal creek allows for hunting ground for birds. You'll even see raccoons will come in here. You'll have some kind of clams, oysters, barnacles growing along the edges sometimes. And so it just kind of helps with the tidal exchange of water in this ecosystem. So here we actually have some of the red mangrove propagules still growing on the tree. And so the propagule itself is actually a seedling of a plant. So it is not a seed, it's an entirely new plant growing on the tree. And so as soon as that plant is ready to start growing on its own, it will actually fall off the tree and it will fall down onto the ground. So we do see a lot of them actually start to grow right where they fall. But now imagine if we had a really high tide and this area was filled with water. If the tide was going in, it would actually push the mangrove propagules inland. If they went into that tidal creek, they can get pushed in that way. They could also get pulled out to the Caloosahatchee. Right? If they fall in the water and we've got an outgoing tide, it will pull them in this direction. So in the distance here, we can actually see the water. And again, if we look, right, predominantly red mangroves right here. And so the one thing that I want to talk about right here is that 4 Mile the one thing I want to talk about here is 4 Mile Ecological Cove actually took a pretty direct hit from Hurricane Irma. And so there's the water is right there, not too far away. And if we look up, not a whole lot of evidence that a hurricane came through here a couple of years ago. Right? But when we get closer to the water, let's take a look. So as we reach the water right here, one of the things that we'll notice is, right, these mangroves actually took that direct hit from Hurricane Irma, and you could see how they've fallen over and they took that direct hit. But real interesting, right, the mangroves, their job is, one of their ecological roles is to protect our coastlines from hurricanes. And just these mangroves right here along the coastline actually took the direct hit from the hurricane. And we were just a few feet behind these mangroves. There was almost no evidence that that hurricane had actually come through here. So we could actually see how well these red mangroves actually stabilize the shoreline. They protect us from storm surges and heavy winds from the hurricanes. So this area out here behind me is the Caloosahatchee River. So we're not all the way down to our coastline yet. So we're still a little bit inland. So while we're stopped here, let's take a minute and let's talk about some of the ecological roles of the mangrove forest. All right, obviously the first one is they protect our coastlines from hurricanes, and we can see just how well they did that right there. The other thing they could protect is they protect our inland freshwater ecosystems from extreme storm surges and extreme high tides. So we've learned about wetlands, and so mangroves are a type of wetland species. And so we've actually walked through a tidal wetland here. This was a mangrove swamp because it is forested. However, right, the water here can be quite brackish. So we are in, right, this is the Caloosahatchee River. We're not too far from the coastline. And so the salinity in here will change year round depending on how much rainfall we've had, how much fresh water is coming out of the Caloosahatchee River, how much water is getting released from Lake Okeechobee. But in the event of an extreme high tide or an extreme storm surge, not specifically here, but anywhere that has mangroves, that's going to have salt water being pushed in, and if it went into our freshwater species, that salt water, if it was there long enough or in a high enough concentration, could kill our freshwater species. Right? But we've learned that wetlands act like a sponge, and they will hold water and they will slow the flow of water. And so if water was to flow into this ecosystem, it would act like a very large sponge and will absorb a lot of that water and slow it down and prevent it from going into our freshwater ecosystems where it could kill our freshwater species. The exact opposite is true as well. If we have an extreme rainfall event near our coastline, right, and all that fresh water goes into our estuaries and drops the salinity all the way down to zero, or to our coastlines where the salinity, where we have species that actually depend on the specific salinity level, that fresh water could drop it down to zero. And so fish and things will actually move away. But if you've got things that can't move, clams, oysters, seagrasses that depend on a specific salinity level, and it drops all the way down to zero for an extended period of time, those species will actually begin to die. And so if we have an extreme rainfall event, the fresh water from the runoff will actually get trapped in our wetland ecosystems here along the coast, right, our mangrove wetlands, and it will hold that water and it will release it slowly, so all of that fresh water does not get dumped into our coastal ecosystems all at once. We'll see a lot more evidence of this when we go to our Bunch Beach tidal wetland location. So in addition to stabilizing the shoreline, protection from storm surges, protection from wind, waves, things like that, mangroves are actually a really great habitat. So our coastal mangroves, right, growing along the coastline here, great habitat for juvenile fish species. Right, so a lot of the fish species will actually use the mangroves as their nesting grounds. And so it prevents larger fish from actually getting the juvenile fish, so they'll grow in the roots here until they're ready to actually go out into larger waters. Since we've got somebody in the background here on the boat playing music, I don't know if you could hear it or not, but they are a great source of recreation as well. So people like to come out here and go kayaking, fishing, things like that. So mangroves are a keystone species in our coastal ecosystems because so many other species depend on them. The other things is that mangroves are great habitat and nesting ground for a lot of bird species. And I realize this clump of mangroves right here, pretty close to the mainland, but you can actually have mangrove islands called overwash forests. And so this is kind of the start of one pretty close to the mainland. But imagine if this was, right, a few hundred feet offshore, right? Mangrove propagule washed out to a sandbar, started to grow, started to stabilize the soil. Another propagule washed out there, that started to grow. Their root structures intertwined with each other. They start to grow. Now they're continuously growing, they're dropping leaves, the leaves are decomposing, right? So they're trapping materials, they're creating soil, and over time it grows into an island. This island, and imagine again, if it was a couple hundred feet offshore, prime nesting ground for birds, right? For two reasons, because in the roots of the mangroves, you're gonna have a lot of food sources because the fish are gonna hang out there. There's gonna be juvenile fish, there's gonna be plenty of fish for the birds. And the other thing is this, if this is a few hundred feet offshore, right, you're safe from predators like raccoons, snakes, anything that's not gonna be able to swim out to this island. So that's why mangroves are great nesting habitats, particularly the mangrove islands. If you know anybody that's lived in Florida for a long period of time and they're kind of local to an area, and you can ask about, you know, some of our islands in the Caloosahatchee River and other places like that, they will tell you that when they were kids, those islands, many of them actually used to be just a big sandbar, and the mangroves have stabilized that sandbar and actually turned it into a real island over time. So as far as ecosystem services of the mangroves go, right, they're great at stabilizing our shorelines, they're great for protecting our coastlines, great for controlling floods, a great habitat. And then the very last thing I want to mention, right, is it's just like trees, right, they're great at providing oxygen. So one of the things I always tell students is if somebody asks you what an ecosystem service of any ecosystem is, right, the really cheap answer is they provide oxygen. So mangroves do provide oxygen, but even more so, right, mangroves are actually one of the most efficient species at carbon sequestration. Right, so these mangroves, right, just like trees, are taking in carbon dioxide, giving off oxygen, right? But as they're doing that, right, so the carbon gets trapped in the mangrove, and the mangroves are continuously dropping leaves. What's in those leaves? Carbon. And then that carbon goes down into the ground and it breaks down, right? So the process of burning fossil fuels, we're taking carbon out of the ground, we're transferring it to the atmosphere, right? Mangroves are some of the most efficient species at taking carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into the tree, putting it into the leaves. As those leaves fall down to the ground, they break down, we're returning that carbon back to the soil, right? So a really important ecosystem service of the mangroves is carbon sequestration. So it's pretty hot in the afternoon here today, and so a lot of the wildlife is probably hunkered down. But again, here's some evidence that, you know, there is wildlife here. So there's a couple of raccoon footprints here. So raccoons will very often travel into the mangroves for food sources, right? Again, there's oysters along the coastline, sometimes there's clams, there's the little mangrove crabs, so there's plenty of food sources for the things like raccoons to come out here. I've never seen one here, but occasionally, well, and we're actually pretty close to Cape Coral here, so there's probably not a lot of panthers around, but panthers also have been known to visit our mangrove ecosystems here in Florida. So as we're walking along here, just a little history on the area. So we are in Cape Coral, Florida, and if you know anything about the history of how Cape Coral was developed, it was kind of an ecological disaster. So most of North Cape Coral was all pine flatwoods and wetlands ecosystems. Most of the timber was harvested, and the wetlands were filled in, and it was just essentially street after street of housing, and well, actually where they intended to put housing. In South Cape Coral and along the coastline, it was all mangrove forest and tidal wetlands. They were all filled in, and the mangroves were actually dug up and piled on top of each other, and that's where the canals in the southern part of Cape Coral were actually built. So this area here was actually mandated by the federal government that they had to set it aside because they had destroyed so much of the existing ecosystems already in Cape Coral. And so that's the reason we have 4 Mile Ecological Cove. And so if you've never been here, it's definitely worth checking out. It's a pretty easy walk. Just bring some water. Sometimes the bugs can be kind of harsh in the morning and the evening. There's actually some pretty neat kayak trails here as well. During certain times of the year, you can rent a kayak, but definitely worth checking out. It's a nice place to watch the sunrise, or even just go for a nice walk. And so I'm gonna head out to my car, and I hope you guys enjoyed this virtual field trip.